Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch. This is the third video in the My Tallies AppIntent series, where we're creating an app that also has interactive and configurable widgets and Siri shortcuts. Well, in this video, we're going to be creating the configurable widget, and it's going to be both interactive when we tap on it outside of the tally itself to be routed to the correct tally in the app. Well, this is the longest video in the series, so be sure that you use the chapter markers that I provided in the description so that you can pause and return to the video at any time that you choose. I love getting your feedback, so if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment below. Make sure you ring the bell to enable notifications and get notified whenever a new video is released. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. A link is in the description. If you're following along with this series, you can continue on from there, as I'm doing here. If you skip the first two videos, you can download the completed source code from that last video from the link in the description. There are several branches, but make sure you download the first widget branch, as this is the completed source code from that second video. The configurable widget branch contains the completed source code for this video and will also serve as the starter source code for the final video. You can just download and expand the zipped archive. The project does require Xcode 16. In the last video, we created a widget that allowed us to view and update the first tally in our tallies array only. Well, in this video, I'd like to create a second widget that will eventually replace the first one, and it'll allow us to select which tally we want to have represented on the widget on our home screen. And this will allow us to have multiple widgets on the home screen, and each one can represent a different tally. Tapping on the value in each widget will have to know which tally it belongs to and update the corresponding tally for our app as well. Similarly, when we tap outside of our value on the widget, we'll want to open our app and navigate to the correct one. So that's our task for this video. Well, we're creating a second widget, but we do not have to create a new extension. We just create a new widget, and we can add that widget to our bundle if we want both of them to be able to be selected from the gallery. This widget type will be different, however, so we can't really just duplicate and modify our existing widget without really knowing what we're doing. When we created the first widget, it came as a template when we created our widget target. Well, there is no template for that if I try to create a new file. So what can you do? Well, what I do is, to make things easier, is I simply create a dummy project and create a new widget extension for that project using the name that I want for the widget in my project, and making sure that I have the right selection checkboxes made. And then I can just copy the two files I need over. So let me show you. In Xcode, I'll create a new project and give it any file name like you like. I'm going to call mine dummy, and I'm going to save it to my desktop. Once the project has been loaded, create a new widget target and choose widget extension. But this time, I'm going to name the extension Configurable Widget, and I'm going to make sure that I have the Include Configuration AppIntent checkbox checked. So you'll find the new target folder, and inside there you'll need the AppIntent Swift file and the Configurable Widget file. So open the AppIntent file first, and notice that the intent is actually called Configuration AppIntent. Well, this is great. The Configurable Widget file, on the other hand, has multiple structs in it, and the first one is provider. So that's going to have to change, as we already have a provider in our first widget. So return to the AppIntent file. Simply copy the imports and the entire intent, everything but the headers, to your clipboard, and move back to your project. Back in your project, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call that folder Configurable Widget. With that folder selected, but not for renaming, simply just paste from the clipboard. And now in Xcode 16, Xcode will create a new file from the clipboard contents, give it the same name of the object within that file, and add headers. We now have that configurable AppIntent in my project. So let's return to the dummy project and copy the imports and the entire Configurable Widget file content. Return to your project and repeat the same process. Select the folder once more and paste. Well, this time, though, a couple of things have gone wrong. First, the file name is not correct, and that's because the file itself has multiple objects in it, and it just chose the first one, which is provider. I want this file name to represent my widget, so I'm going to rename the file Configurable Widget. The second issue is that within the file, there's that timeline provider that's named provider. So we already have one in our simple widget. So what I'll need to do is rename it and rename it to config widget provider. However, if we do a traditional renaming by refactoring and letting Xcode do it, it'll rename both this one and the other one, and we'll be back at the same place. So within this file, though, there are just 3 occasions or occurrences of this struct name. So first rename the struct itself to config widget provider. And then inside the configurable widget entry view, the entry has to be a config widget provider.entry type. And the third instance is within the configurable widget struct itself. There should be no errors now, and we're good to go. As we did on our previous widget, we're going to do some renaming so that it better represents our models and what we're doing. So let's remove that comment first. In the preview, I'm going to remove one of the timeline views as we again will be providing updates on demand. Next, I'm going to refactor and rename simple entry as configurable entry. Notice that since the configurable entry has a date, which is required, but it also has a configuration, which is that configuration AppIntent. And also note that the provider is not just a timeline provider like our first widget, it's an AppIntent timeline provider. So this means that our 3 functions, the placeholder, snapshot, and timeline, have a configuration argument now along with the context. So before we go and make any more modifications, we should work on that AppIntent that will provide the configuration. Well, this intent is different from our update tally intent, which was just an AppIntent. This is a widget configuration intent, and it has different requirements. It does have the title and description like our other one, but no perform function. Instead, it has a parameter that is, in this case, a favorite emoji, which is a string, and there is a default one. Well, we want to change this parameter to be one that is an object that will represent the names of all of the tallies. It also be able to provide me with some kind of an ID that will point to the actual tally that I can direct my widget to and update and navigate to when tapped. And this is called an app entity. So first, let's update the title and description. For the title, we can change it to selected tally. For the description, let's say, choose your tally from the list. Now I'm going to leave the parameter alone here for a minute so we can create that entity that we'll need. So let's create that struct right here and call it tally entity. That is of type app entity. And an app entity has 3 requirements. First, it requires an ID that's an object identifier and it has to be unique. Now, since our tally has a unique name, which is a string, we'll be able to use that as our identifier. But it needs to be called ID, and we'll be, when we're creating app entities, assigning our tally name as the ID. It also requires a static var called type display representation. And for this, I'll use the name initializer and simply supply the string selected tally. It needs a display representation that is of type display representation. So that's what I'm going to be using for the item display to pick from. For us, this is going to be the name of our tally. Well, I'm going to also use that for the name of the ID of our entity. So I can use a computed property to create a display representation where the title then is our ID, but we will need to use string interpolation here for that ID, which is an object identifier. And it also now requires a static default query that is of some type entity query. So we're going to have to create that first, and I'm going to call that tally query so that my default query will be one of these tally queries. Well, let's create that tally query right here now then. And it conforms to the entity query protocol. This protocol, like others, has some requirements. And the first thing that it requires is an entities for the function. The identifiers are an array of types that are the same as your entity.id property. And for us, that's a string. And it will return an array of entity types, and that's our tally entity. And then to stop the complaining, let's just return an empty array for now. So how can we get an array of tally entity that requires an ID property, which is a string that will represent the name of our tally? Well, we can use Swift data to fetch all of our tallies and then use a map function on that array simply to create a new array of tally entities where we can supply the tally name as the ID. Well, we did something like that by fetching our tallies in the last video to get all of our tallies in an array. So first then we'll need to import Swift data. And then I'm just going to go to that first tally widget and copy that getTallies function. Now I'll need to rename this as suggested entities. And it's going to return an array of tally entity, not tally. Suggested entities, it's important to name it that. And what's missing is this container. But we can create that directly inside the function because it's only going to be used here. So we'll let the container be equal to a model container for tally.self. Well, we can then get all entities by taking that optional all tallies array and then use the map function to get a single tally from which we can use its name to create our matching entity. And this entity only requires that ID, so we'll assign it the tally name. Now this is an optional array, so we can return it or we can return an empty array. Oh, I forgot. We need a try here to create this container. And then we should supply a default result. And that will be a default value that's optional. And since we'll be getting the first one, which is a result of calling our getTallies function, it has to be asynchronous. And this is what's going to be used in the gallery for our widget. So when we select this widget, we should see our first tally. And then we can return the result by trying and waiting the call to the suggested entities first. Now that we have everything we need for our query, so instead of returning an empty array, we'll try and await the call to the suggested entities to get all, and then we can filter them based on where the array of identifiers contains the iterator's ID. So this will give us our picker or list of entities. And finally, then we can change our parameter to be a selected tallies string. And for the default, we can just specify nil. And the parameter variable will be an optional tally entity. Let me fix that typo. Now we can finally return to our widget and finish it up. So let's go to our configurable widget and add a new property to our timeline entry after the configuration. We'll call it selected tally, and it's going to be an optional tally. Well, this is, as before, going to require my fixing up the three functions and the preview. So For all three functions now, I'll just supply nil for the selected tally. And then for the preview, I'll supply an instance of the configuration AppIntent for the configuration, and then nil for the selected tally. Now I can remove this entire extension here because we built our new one out entirely within the intent itself. In the configurable widget entry view, let me just remove all references to that emoji. So now we'll have to go back up and fix our snapshot and timeline functions just to provide a real selected tally instead of nil. Well, this can all be done by querying Swift data because our configuration is going to supply us with an ID, and that ID is the name of a tally. So then we can use that to query our tally array and return the first one where the name of the tally matches that ID. So first, then let's import Swift data. So let's create a function that's going to execute on the main thread, so main actor. The function will be called getTally, and it'll have one parameter, an optional string. And it can throw an error, but it'll return an optional tally. We're going to need a model container. So I'm going to scroll back to the top of the configure widget provider, and I'll create a container that's a model container. And we're going to create an instance of this by trying to access and create a model container for tally.self. And then I'll return the instance. Well, then we can use a guard check to make sure that the name is not optional, else we'll just return nil. Then we can create a predicate where it's a predicate of a tally, and we'll simply compare the iterator's name with our name. Now we'll form a descriptor by using a fetch descriptor of type tally, passing in that predicate. The found set of tallies will be the result of using an optional try to use the container's main context to fetch the descriptor. And then we return the first one, which may not in theory exist, so it's optional. Well, then let's go back now to fix our snapshot function. First, I'll get the selected tally by using an optional try and awaiting the result of calling that getTally function where the name is the configuration's selected tally's ID property, which, as we know, is the name of the tally. Notice how I did not need to embed this content within a task unit of work? And that's because this function itself is asynchronous. Then we can return the configurable entry using the selected tally instead of nil. On to the timeline entry now. As in our first widget example, we will be updating this on demand, so we'll need to remove this and start from scratch. Again, we'll start by creating a current date property, which is just date.now. And then I can copy the selected tally from above and use it. We can then create our entry by creating a configurable entry where the date is that current date and the configuration is the timeline configuration and the selected tally is that tally. I can then return a timeline where the array of entries is just our single entry in an array. And the policy will be at end. My preview should be working now. I'm not sure why not. Let me check. Oh, of course, this has to be an instant of that intent. Great. It's working now. So let's add some modifiers to our widget. I'm just going to add a configuration display name of tally. I'll add a description that will be update your tally. Again, I'm only going to support small widgets, so a supported families where the array is just simply the system small. And we'll set the content margins to be disabled. The widget entry view will be very similar to the first one that we used in our first widget, except that we are going to have to create a new app intent for the value, and we'll do this shortly. But first, if the entry selected tally is nil, we can provide a content unavailable view again with the string no tallies yet. And I'll use a system image plus .circle.fill. Else, we can display that single tally view, and I'll pass in a size of 60 as we did in the first one. And the tally will be that unwrapped entries selected tally. Well, now that we have this new widget created, we can add it to our widget bundle. So I'll open the My Tallies widget bundle and simply add the configurable widget below the first tally widget. Before we test, though, I've discovered that I've made one crucial omission in my app intent. In this suggested entries function, I failed to specify that it has to be asynchronous. So let me add that now, and everything should just work fine. So let's test this out now while running our app in the simulator. We'll exit to the home screen. I'll long press to edit and add a widget. And now I see that I have two widgets to choose from. I'm going to scroll to the second one and select it. So now I have two widgets on my home screen. The one with the name is the original widget. The one without the name is showing our new one. And by default, it's showing the first widget as we made that our default. So I'm going to long press on the widget, and you'll be able to edit the widget itself. And you can then see that we have access to both of our tallies in this selection list. So let me select beta. And then the tally goes to 0, which is the current value for our beta tally. So let me switch back to alpha. If I tap on the widget, I do not get an update to the value because we still have to create an intent for that. I can, though, within the app, update that tally. When I return there to the home screen, I see that both our original and our new one are updated because in our code, we are updating all widgets. Let me delete that first one. Now I'm going to add a second widget for beta. It defaulted to the alpha, which was our first widget. So let me choose either one of them, long press, edit the widget, and select beta. Now, if I tap on the widget, it doesn't go directly to the right one. It just goes to the first one. However, if I select that one, I choose, I can update it here. And when I return to the home screen, I see that it has been updated there as well. So those are two things I have to fix. The ability to update the tally from the widget and be routed to the correct tally when I tap outside the value from the widget. First, let's create that app intent. It'll be very similar to the first one, so we're going to start with it. Inside the Configurable Widget folder, let's create a new file and call it Configurable AppIntent. Then go to the original Update AppIntent and copy all of its contents, including the imports, and then return to that new file and replace the content with that import. And then change the name of the intent to Configurable Update Intent. Now let's see what has to change. I'm going to leave the title and description the same. However, I'll need a parameter that will represent the name of the selected tally. So a parameter with a title, tally, and the name, which is a string. I'll need an initializer. I'll let Xcode do that for me. But I'll also need an empty initializer. So let's add a string name parameter to the update tally function, and then we'll have to determine which tally that name belongs to and return the value of that particular tally. In the perform function, then, we can pass in our parameter as an argument for that function. So we'll let update be equal to awaiting the call to the update tally, passing in the name. The update tally function doesn't need a sort descriptor, but it does need a predicate, and that predicate will be able to use to find one tally where the name matches the name of the tally. So it's a tally predicate where the iterator's name is equal to the parameter's name. So our descriptor then becomes the fetch descriptor where the predicate is our predicate. The rest should be pretty much the same, except that we'll change all tallies to be found tallies, because that's what we're getting now. So back in the widget view, then, we can turn that single tally view into a button where its label and its action intent is our intent. So first we'll embed it in a VStack, create that button where the intent is the configurable update intent, where we'll pass in the entries selected tally.name as the name, and it can be unwrapped. And the label then will be that single tally view. Again, let's set that button style to plain. And then below that, we're going to display a text view displaying the selected tally name, and we'll have to unwrap the selected tally. So let's build and run this now and test it out. Once the app is run, I'll exit to the home screen. Let me tap on the value for alpha, and we see it updates. Let me do the same for beta. Great, both are updating. If I tap outside the value on alpha, the app opens, and I'm right at alpha. If I return to the home screen, let me add one more to beta. But if I tap outside and go to the app, it's still showing alpha. I can go to it, and I can see that it has been updated. But what I want to happen is that it gets routed here directly. And that's what we'll do in the final section of this video. So let's get at that now. Currently, when we tap on the outside of the value, it just opens the application. Now, in SwiftUI, we can also provide a unique URL to pass on to the app. And we can do that through the use of a link, where we can create our own unique URL to pass on to the opening app. So what we have to do is to create a link that will cover the entire widget. So I'm going to embed in a ZStack. Then as the first element in the ZStack, I'm going to add a color view that's clear. So it's going to expand and cover the entire widget. Now when I tap anywhere on the widget except for on the value AppIntent button, our app will open and it'll pass on a value. So I'm going to wrap the entire ZStack in a link where the destination is a URL made from some string. So let's start with an empty string and make sure we create a valid URL so we can unwrap it. Now we can just make up a URL any way we want as long as it will be unique to our app and to the tally the widget is made from. Now a URL is made up of a scheme like HTTP or FTP, so we can make up our own scheme. So how about MTLS to stand for My Tallies, for example? And then like other schemes, ://. And this is followed by a host like www or FTP. So we can again make up our own. So how about tally? And the last path component then can be our unique tally name. And that's our entries selected tally name. And we'll use string interpolation for that and unwrap the selected tally. So this is going to be unique for every single one of our tallies. And you see what effect this has. We can go to our iOS target entry point and apply an onOpenURL method to the view that'll give us the URL that we can use in the body to do our routing. So for now, let's just create that open URL that'll get the URL and print it out. So let me run the app from the iOS target now, and I'll exit to the home screen. But if we tap outside though, the app opens and you can see that our URL is printed to the console. Each widget will present a different unique URL. So what we have to do then is to make sure that our URLs scheme and host are the correct ones, the MTLS and tally, and then we can extract the last path component that'll give us the name of the tally that we need to route to. So we use a guard statement. We're checking if the URL.scheme is equal to MTLS and the URL's host is equal to tally, else we'll simply return and not do anything because it's got some stray URL from somewhere. Now, instead of printing the URL, we want to notify our app that it has arrived and use that to set the selected widget on our main view to the one that has that name. And the best way to do this is to create an observable router class that we can add to the environment. So I'm going to create a new Swift file called router, but make sure that you create this file in the iOS target and not on the widget. So we'll create a class within here called router and apply the observable macro. Well, this class only is going to have one property, and that's the tally name, but it's an optional string because if we open the app directly from the icon, there'll be no URL. And then we need to create an initializer, and we can assign nil to the tally name in the initializer. So to inject this into the environment, at our app entry point, we'll create a state property that is a router instance. And then instead of printing out that URL, we'll assign the URL's last path component to the router's tally name property. And then finally, we can inject that router object into the environment for our other views to have access to. Well, there's only one view that needs to access that, and that's the tally selection view. So within that view, we'll create an environment using router.self and simply call it router. So any changes to router will get notified. And then to stop the preview from complaining, we'll have to inject an instance of that router into the previous environment. So we can then create an onChange modifier and see if the router's tally name is different from the current selected tally name. And then if it is, we can find that one that has that name and apply it to the selected tally. So an onChange of router.tallyName, and that's going to give us an old value and a new value that we can use in our action. So we can do a comparison. If the new value is not equal to the selected tally name, then the selected tally can be assigned the tallies first, the first tally, where the name is equal to the new value. So let's test this out one more time then. When I run the app, I see that we're shown our first tally, alpha. Let me exit to the home screen. I'm going to tap outside of the value on beta. And I see the app opens and I get routed correctly. Let me add a new widget. So within the app, I'm going to create a new widget, and I'm just going to call it Delta. Let me exit to the home screen again, and I'm going to long press, choose Edit, and add a widget. Scroll to the second one and add a new widget. And as before, it defaults to the first one. So I need to long press, and I'll edit the widget, and I'll change it to Delta. So I can tap on the value, and it updates as expected. And then when I go outside the app, it opens because I had left it at Delta, and there is no change in the router name. It still sees Delta, but the value has increased to 3. Wow, well that's it for this video. And there's only one more to come. In the next video, we'll retire our first widget altogether and add Siri Shortcuts so that we'll be able to either use a shortcut to update any one of our tallies or use Siri to invoke the shortcut to do the update for any tally we choose. So if you've enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment below. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and enable notifications so that you're made aware of new videos that I release. And you can also download my free channel listing app to be able to search for and find content from any one of my close to 350 Swift and SwiftUI related videos. Hope to see you in the next one.